Hello, everyone. I just want to say welcome to the Australian National University Zoom webinar on the US elections being hosted by the ANU College of Law. I want to begin by making an acknowledgement of country. So we want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on whose lands we meet. So here at the ANU campus in Acton, that's the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples, we acknowledge the continuing issues of sovereignty and the historical legacies that call for reconciliation. And we want to pay our respects to the elders past, present, and emerging in the future. Today, I want to introduce the people who are on the panel. We are joined from the United States by three distinguished academics, beginning with Alison Renteln. She's a professor at the University of Southern California. She holds a joint appointment in the law school, Department of Politics and International Relations, and then the School of Public Policy. At the University of Minnesota, we're joined by Christopher Roberts, who's from the University of Minnesota School of Law. And then from George Mason University in Virginia, we're joined by Associate Professor Cher, Weixia, Chen. And then Christopher, I forget, he's also Associate Professor, so apologies for that. From the Australian side, we're joined by Professor Zoe Robinson, who's professor at the School of Politics and International Relations, and then Shawn Treier, who's senior lecturer at the School of Politics and International Relations at the Australian National University, and then, of course, me as the moderator from the Australian National University College of Law. There's been quite a number of things that have been happening with the US elections. I think everyone in the audience has been tracking what's played out and what's been happening. So there is no final result, but I think everyone knew that that was going to be the situation. So the focus of the conversation today follows a number of topics related to the election that people should be mindful of as we wind our way towards a final decision of the outcome, and as we try to think through collectively about the implications going towards the future. So the first category of things to sort of discuss is what's played out with the election so far. So specifically, these are issues rising with the electorate and what we now think we understand about the nature of the voting population in the United States. So to begin that discussion, I will start with Alison, and then we'll lead into the other panelists from there. So Alison, what were the observations that you came across during this election?
Well, thanks to ANU for this opportunity. And it is a very exciting time, a very momentous occasion. And we really don't know the results, but there are certain states that are the battleground states, I guess, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Wisconsin. And so I guess people are watching these very carefully. I think Biden is thought to have something about 243 electoral votes now, and Trump about 214. And the president has to have, the winning president has to have 270. I guess part of the difficulty is that we have to worry about whether the exit polls are accurate. We can't really trust the pollsters. So there's a kind of a sense of disbelief right now in the United States because we were led to believe that Biden was so far ahead. And so this sort of is reminiscent of 2016. So it's not a landslide for Joe Biden by any means. It's going to be very close, as my colleagues will discuss, I'm sure. And this is, has happened in the past when the Chicago Tribune read a headline that New York Governor Thomas Dewey had beaten President Harry Truman, and this was like the worst nightmare for an editor of a paper. And in the Florida elections, the TV networks twice blew it when they declared that George Bush had won. So we have a history of this. And so I just want to say, you have to take what we say with a grain of salt today because we're relying on information from the exit polls, I believe most of us. I think one thing that we're observing is the hyperpolarization that has been increasingly a problem in the United States, and that's been intensified by the pandemic. So we're seeing that, I think, reflected in the voting. For one thing, the voting turnout is, I think, higher than it's been since the 1900 or something. So the turnout itself is already something that's noteworthy. And if we look at the breakdown in terms of race and ethnicity, there are certain patterns that people are observing. That, for example, almost 90% of Blacks are voting for Biden, for instance. But the analysis of the Latino vote seems more complicated, that we need to have a more nuanced approach to the so-called Latino or Latinx vote, and we need to disaggregate the vote. Evidently, Florida is thought to have gone for Trump, partly because of support he had from Cuban Americans and from Venezuelan Americans. So I think that it depends on the region of the country. Commentators have noted that Latinos in Arizona seem to be voting for Biden in large part because of the anti-immigrant rhetoric. So I think one has to be careful in trying to discern patterns in voting when looking at ethnic and racial groups based on the region of the country, and also what sorts of rhetoric seems to be pervading that particular area. The gender vote is, I think, what people expected, which is that more women are voting for Biden, considerably more than for Trump. I think that's not surprising. Maybe others will want to comment on the gender gap in more detail. I think also interesting is that women have been more active in giving money, in phone campaigns, in the political process in this particular election. And then I think another interesting aspect of the voting pattern has been the age demographic, that younger people, by a large margin, we mean 18 to 29-year-olds, 61% are thought to be voting for Biden and 35% for Trump. And older voters, one would have thought that they would continue to prefer Trump as they did in 2016, because older people seem to like Trump and they tend to vote conservative. But increasingly, perhaps because of the pandemic, even though they like the fact that Trump reminds them of a better time in their lives, the fact that the Biden campaign has successfully emphasized the failure of the Trump administration to handle the pandemic and the cutting of benefits and so on, it seems that more of the older demographic is voting for Biden than people may have expected. I think I should give my colleagues a chance to comment, but I think it's interesting to see some of the shifts that are occurring in voting behavior and the criticisms of candidates for not paying more attention to certain groups. So Biden has been criticized, for example, for not courting the Latino vote earlier on. And so I think it's interesting that during this very kind of polarized time in the United States, that people are beginning to realize that it's important to note differences in people's worldview and cultural backgrounds.
All right, thank you for that. Cher, do you have observations that you wanted to make as well?
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, ANU. Alison already has a very thorough examination of the voting blocks. I just want to mention two other voting blocks. One is why non-college voters. Arguably, no other group was more central to Trump's surprise success in 2016 than why non-college educated voters. In the past surveys, the group has said it was their anxiety about changing American culture, demographically, and in terms of values that have led them to Trump and his conviction that America was at its greatest in years past, has made America great again. And this year, according to CNN, white voters with college degrees also shifted slightly towards Biden. And he captured a double-digit lead with this group in Michigan, in Arizona, and also in Pennsylvania. And Clinton did not win this group in any of the states in 2016. So I also want to emphasize that group youth. So millennials are the largest voting bloc this election, and combined with Generation Z voters under the age of 40, they play a significant influence in the outcome of election this year. nearly 10 million young voters had cast ballots before election day, so they contributed significantly to the early voting. And voters aged 18 to 29, they did not show up for Clinton in a previous election, and as compared to Obama. But according to the CNN exit poll, more voters under age 30 have flocked to Biden in several important Midwestern states and in Arizona. And Trump, he lost support among this age group in these 4 key swing states: Arizona, Ohio, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, compared with 2016. So I think several factors may have contributed to higher early turnout, despite there have been unique barriers to voting during a pandemic for youth that has displaced many of them from their homes or from their campuses. So one thing is overall surge in interest in alternative voting options because of COVID-19. So early votes now have been made available in the majority of the states. Second is the activism. And I think activism has prompted youth greater political and electoral engagement. Major social movements driven by young activists around climate change, around gun safety and Black Lives Matter protests have led to an explosion of civic awareness among younger Americans. And I will stop here, and I think other colleagues may have more insights.
So Zoe, you've spent time in both the United States and Australia. So I wonder if you had sort of comments about the connections or similarities or differences between the two.
Oh, look, it's a completely different world, isn't it? So in Australia, as probably most of the audience will know, we have an independent electoral commission that draws our electoral boundary lines, and we have a single voting day on a Saturday. We get our sausage after we cast our vote. And it all seems nice and happy. Whereas in the US, particularly in the time of COVID, there's all of these different machinations of both how you vote, depending on where you live on the state, depending on where you live in a county level. So that there are a lot of differences between the country itself that I'm following Australians on social media, particularly on Twitter, just who are flabbergasted by the mess that some of the states seem to be in terms of casting votes and counting votes. I do think that it's important, just kind of connecting to what Cher and Alison were saying before about the vote share and demographics and how it's looking, that we need to be really careful about drawing conclusions at this stage, because these are based on exit polls. And as we are aware now, we have a lot of early voters that tend to swing Democrat. So the exit polls are necessarily going to be biased towards the Republicans. So we can't really take, I don't think, too much from these preliminary exit polls. I think there's going to have to be a lot of work done by scholars and pollsters after the fact to try to work out what the vote share looks like. So I do think there are some interesting things that have come out of those. For example, Trump increased his vote share amongst Black men. But again, those are exit polls and a lot of people have voted early. So whether that actually holds when we account for those early votes and the mail-in votes, it's a separate question. I think the statistic that I saw that I thought was very interesting that will hold is the lack of impact of COVID-19 on Trump's electoral share. So I saw some really fascinating statistics out of some counties with really high COVID death rates and high infection rates. And Trump's vote share not only remained stable in a number of them, but went up in a number of those as well. And so it's really interesting that what has happened with the pandemic hasn't depressed his vote in a number of those areas.
Shawn or Chris, did you have a response to anything that's been said so far about the election patterns or voting patterns?
Sure. So like last night, the predicted blue wave did not materialize, and a malevolent underdog seemingly pulled out a shocking upset. But besides state of origin, the election was also pretty shocking. I mean, for a lot of us, there was this sort of buildup of as mentioned before, a large sort of landslide victory. Of course, one thing that should be remembered is that that was never sort of a guarantee, even in the context of the polling error. Like, it was maybe more one should probably say it was more comforting that you had a polling of 8%, because you knew that if it swung a particular way, you might still have a 3% gain. It's, as Zoe says, it's going to take a long time for us to sort out like what we're going to see as a consequence of what we predicted, what we done predicted. For instance, the last time the national polls were pretty close on, and we're still counting a lot of ballots. There's a lot of ballots in California and New York. So we still might see the national average get a little bit closer to what we saw in the pre-polls, which I want to separate between the aforementioned exit polls are very much different than the polls most of us think of. The exit polls are these that you actual voters from the booth, why they voted, various information. They're not very good at predicting ever. They were useful in the 80s when it was pretty easy to predict electoral college votes by the national vote. Just any sort of indication you got the way a district was swinging gave you an indication of what that vote was. Those days are long gone. The ones that we normally think about is the surveys that have been running constantly before election. Those they're in one sense relatively accurate, and in another sense, we're probably asking way too much to pick up all the myriad of coalitions that are being put together. And it's clear that they're missing in some sense either in the turnout model or various groups that cut across partisan lines, or simply, the couple percentage here and there that break near the end, which probably happened again in this election. There were fewer undecideds, but they probably also broke again as well. So there will, of course, be another autopsy on polling again, and there'll be another report, but there's probably a lot of issues to sort of hang, but it's going to be a long process before we know what really happened.
Chris?
Just as Shawn is saying, it's going to be a long time before we know what happens. I work in the area of legal history, so I look at how the past informs the present and the future. And we live in a moment now that is going to be the subject of study and inquiry for decades, if not centuries out. I mean, we live in a real transformative moment. And that's something for us to take into account when we're trying to figure out what's happening, because some of the older rules, perhaps a lot of the older rules, standards, the polling algorithms simply aren't able to grasp what exactly is going on right now. But there are some things at a broad level that we can say. And one of the things that I've noticed at this broader level is what seems to be animating so many Americans right now are two things. We have fear and belonging. There is the fear of the unknown, the fear of the uncertainty, the fear that COVID will kill a family member, destroy the economy, make you lose your job and you will lose your place. But then there is this need for belonging that we all have, and we find protection and safety when we're able to associate in groups, be it party, be it ethnic group, be it a civic organization or neighborhood group. And we right now are scrambling to find our place and our places of belonging in ways that are changing right now. And so the older communities and the older groups that we sought refuge in aren't necessarily there. But I think it's those two things, fear and belonging right now, that you can really trace back to all the strange and unusual occurrences and decisions that people are making right now.
Okay. So thank you for that. So this provides an interesting transition then, because, if voters are trying to address internalized senses of fear, belonging, if they're trying to engage in sort of this politicking with coalitions and, exhibiting out across various demographics and patterns of behavior, I mean, they're doing it within a system of election rules, right? So I think this is, this raises this question as to what's been playing out. And this is one of the controversies that we see now is, sort of the challenges to the election rules, the way the elections are done within American democracy. And even now, you see that the Trump administration is attempting to litigate out the current vote counts. So, you know, I want to continue on that for just a little bit. So, you know, so Shawn, you know, do you have a sense as to some of the issues about the election rules or the way it's being done in the United States?
Well, I think probably what probably surprises Australians, they've learned more and more this year than ever before, was just there's just so many stages where you can get tripped up. So just speaking very generically, you know, you've got sort of the idea of registration, which is complicated. It's not perfect in Australia because we don't necessarily get young people immediately registered. There isn't really sort of a, you get fined when you're registered if you don't vote, but you don't necessarily if you don't register. But sort of the same level of sort of dysfunction is just probably strange. The idea of having to sort of actively go out and sort of put your hand up to vote and sort of know the paperwork is in itself a difficult. And this election probably highlighted it, where more people wanted to vote than ever before. And then all of a sudden they find out all the roadblocks they have to go through in order to do that. Also probably uniquely in probably the last 10 years. So Australians might be familiar with sort of like what happened in 2000 and everything, but there were a lot of sort of legal decisions that sort of came down in the last sort of decade that have sort of exasperated many of the problems. So one of the critical elements of elections in the United States is something called the Voting Rights Act, which was basically to ameliorate the issues in the South. That was basically by disenfranchisement through administrative practice. And so effectively, all electoral practices in places that had long histories of discrimination had to have all of their changes of procedures and their initial procedures approved. This was vacated effectively by the Supreme Court in 2013. And one element of that has been a lot of those precincts and board of elections have now been able to make changes to the elections that actually did have some very adverse effects. And so we saw in the last couple election cycles some of the extremely long lines that you would see in primaries and elections were the result of precincts being closed that normally would not have been permitted to be closed. So they're just one of them, and people have heard of sort of the identification requirements that ostensibly to deal with voting fraud, which is practically non-existent, but largely is really a drive to, as many people are observing, it almost seems as the United States would rather people not vote. And that in some sense has been sort of the conflict, is that when one side decides that it probably helps to depress turnout rather than encourage it, you do have sort of this macabre of conflict over what should be sort of a fairly, as Zoe pointed out, a very non-political element of the state.
Yeah. So I just want to touch on so you're alluding to something in the past. So the case that you were mentioning from 2013 regarding the Voting Rights Act, that was Shelby versus Holder. And so for Australian audiences, just so you're aware of this, and the decision from the Supreme Court in that case, they had said that they were going to remove the requirement upon certain southern states to get pre-approval from the US Attorney General to go ahead and modify the voting laws. So basically it was a situation where the Voting Rights Act had said that because of the historical disenfranchisement of African Americans in the South, that certain states needed, in order to change the voting rules, had to get pre-approval from the Attorney General of the United States. And then Shelby versus Holder in 2013 removed that, saying with the argument that those kinds of issues were no longer prevalent. But it then gave free rein to a lot of these states to start modifying or changing their voting laws. Which raises, though, this question about the history of enfranchisement and the history of the way voting has been done. I just want to touch just with Chris, since he has some awareness of US history on this.
Right. So this is a huge issue. And one of the things to think about relates to what I said before in terms of we have a series of laws, a series of norms that are ostensibly there to protect against certain evils. So we have the Voting Rights Act. We have all sorts of policies and programs and norms against voter disenfranchisement because of the long-standing history we have where, in particular, African Americans were prevented through a whole slew of ways from reaching the ballot box, even when they have the right to do so. But what we're seeing today in so many different respects constitutes voter disenfranchisement, but it's not necessarily under the same color or species as previous modes of voter disenfranchisement. So we have the issue of preventing the ballots of people who have voted prior to the election legally under the rules of the state. We have the lawsuits that the Trump administration is putting forward, so those votes won't count. That's a problem. We have a lot of inner city areas, Detroit, there are areas in Minneapolis where I live, where there's just aren't the resources, the voting resources necessary to have speedy voting lines where people can take off an hour from their work, vote, and then go back to work. We don't have a national day for voting. We have to take off work generally to do that. And we've seen around the country in places like Georgia, lines that stretch for almost miles and people standing there for hours upon hours upon hours. Now, this does not constitute voter disenfranchisement or voter suppression at a legal level, but it certainly is voter suppression if it's done in a way that is intended to prevent a certain community of people from voting. And generally it's those who are more likely to vote against the people who are challenging the ballots and challenging the various policies and practices and restricting the resources for the voting places. And so we see voter suppression, not necessarily in the ways that we've seen it in the past, but it certainly is happening today under a different name, under a different set of strategies. And I think that's one thing that in the US we really need to figure out how we can do better at recognizing it when we see it. And I'll just end with one very unpopular idea, and that is we practice voter suppression legally by preventing prisoners from voting, and in many, many states from ex-felons or people who have committed felonies from voting for the rest of their lives. Now, Democrats and Republicans alike seem to, by and large, be okay with this. That's changing, but I would put forth that no matter who you are, if you are in a place where the government has control of your life, and we all live in those places, you should have a say, you should have a right to vote. And we don't do that universally in this country, and I think that's a problem, and I think we really do need to start looking at those areas where we have accepted it and not really given it much thought, but it exists all around us, and we're all part of it, and that if we don't push up against what we are doing and have been doing.
Okay. So, Alison, you've done some work regarding disenfranchisement and suppression of marginalized communities. So I'm just curious if you had a response.
Well, I completely agree with Chris's account, and I think that denying people who have been incarcerated a vote clearly violates human rights. The European Court of Human Rights has ruled on that. I believe the California ballot measure is going to restore the rights to felons, but the problem of mass incarceration in the United States is pretty severe and devastating. And so that I think it's really important that that was mentioned. I think with respect to these various kinds of formal and informal voter suppression methods, there are public organizations that are working to empower people to challenge these. So there's Common Cause. The Southern Poverty Law Center has attempted to give phone numbers to people and have people available as advisors who speak different languages, so that if people do encounter some of these barriers, they should have been able to seek, some counsel on that. Common cause is another. And I think that this is such an enormous subject that we can't really, it deserves more time than we can give to it in this session. But I think the having mandatory voting and having days off to vote, I mean, we can learn a lot from other countries like Australia if we want to really have a more, have a stronger democracy and encourage political participation. I think in a world with COVID, it's obviously more challenging, but it seems to me that Jonathan's earlier point about whether, how many days will be allowed in these different disputes for people to have their ballots counted. I mean, in general, one would think that when there's some kind of catastrophe or national emergency, that there would be a concerted effort to modify the rules. And so it seems to me that it's, mean-spirited basically to try to manipulate rules to further disenfranchise people than already exists. And I guess one of the things I'm worried about is that whether the court, which has 3 appointees by President Trump, will have some sort of incentive to view any challenges to the voter suppression in a way that might give the appearance of a conflict of interest or an actual conflict of interest. So that's a concern I have regarding these voter suppression disputes.
Okay. Cher, since you also deal with social movements and the problems of social movements trying to express themselves, did you have any thoughts with relation to the voter suppression tactics?
Actually, I think there are 2 things I would like to point out. One is in terms of the possible legal challenges to the U.S. Supreme Court. It seems in the past 2 weeks, the Supreme Court has handed down several decisions regarding voting rules, and it's inconsistent. And so it's hard to discern whether there's a pattern we can hold on to. I think one thing we could say is just Chief Justice Roberts' opinion. It seems to suggest that they would defer to the state level, either state legislature or state court or state election officers. So hopefully they could shed some light on the possible outcome of those legal challenges. And in terms of student activism on voter suppression, and this has become one of the key issues for social movement lately, I think, around the campuses. So I would see, students, they have been very, very much motivated by some stories that, keep the campuses closed, because then we will have over 4 million left-leaning college students couldn't get to vote. So that has become one of the motivations for student activism. And I do think voter suppression together with racial justice, they overlap, they intersect. And for this election year, it has become one of the key agenda items for social movement around the campuses.
Okay. So thanks for that. There's something I just wanted to touch on that you mentioned earlier about sort of the cases that are sort of working their way through the courts, because, and Trump's administration, as we mentioned earlier, is in the process of litigating further regarding the vote counts. So I just want to clarify, again, for Australian audiences, that there are potential legal theories that Trump and his advisors will be trying to pursue with respect to the vote counts. So 2 potential areas you're sort of seeing unfold, 2 potential strategies you're starting to see unfold now. There may be more that play out in the future. Is one that they're attempting to argue that there's been some internal violation of state laws. So in other words, each state is responsible under the Constitution with Article 1, I think it was Section 4, the state legislatures are responsible for setting voting laws. And so the legal theory is that somehow what states have done are inconsistent with their own laws. So in particular, you're seeing a situation in Michigan where the Trump administration is arguing that there's been a violation of state laws regarding the presence of observers, in particular that the Republican Party observers, each party is allowed to have observers present when they're counting ballots, and that the Republican Party observers were not being allowed to engage in observation. The other potential legal strategy is just in the nature of the constitutionality, that potentially that some of the modifications that were made in the voting laws with respect to mail-in ballots to accommodate or to deal with COVID-19 were done without the participation and the involvement of the state legislatures. So as a result, it's a violation of the US Constitution. Now, whether or not those arguments proceed or go forward, whether or not the Supreme Court grants certiorari to even hear those cases, and where, what the decisions are with respect to venues, either at the state level or the federal level, these are things that we're going to have to sort of witness and observe. But this provides a very good transition to Zoe, who's a scholar of the judiciary, and raises the question or highlights the role of the judiciary going forward. So Zoe, did you have observations or concerns, I guess is probably the better word, about the nature of the judiciary as a result of the Trump administration, and then in relation to this election at the moment?
Yeah, look, for the first thing, let me just respond a little bit to what Jonathan has just said about the possible legal challenges. There, of course, remains avenues for the Trump administration to follow, and they seem to be falling in one of three categories. So first, Trump is trying to seek a recount in those states where it's very close. Recounts efforts are probably going to be unsuccessful. Some of the states that are close, they're not close enough in order to trigger a recount, and recounts rarely work to shift votes for the kind of numbers that Trump really needs to overcome Biden in those states. There are studies that show that recounts shift to an average of around 280 votes. And in some of the areas where Trump's trying to challenge, he's looking at around 10,000 votes. The campaign's also trying to stop the count in certain states. And this is what Jonathan was alluding to before, which is the idea that the county level accommodations for COVID-19 and voting procedures often are in opposition to what the state law already says. But I take away from some of the challenges that have already been dismissed. One challenge along those grounds was dismissed, saying that this wasn't a valid challenge. This is in Arizona for 120,000 votes, and it was thrown out by a district court judge who was a very far-right Republican. And then the Trump campaign's filing in Pennsylvania saying that they didn't have the right opportunities to watch the votes being counted. And look, there's a lot out there with election law scholars that are saying that these challenges are unlikely to be successful. I think somebody said that election litigation filings like have been going out is basically like a paid tweet. You're just attaching a litigation form to a tweet and paying a lot of money for it. So I'm not so sure that these challenges are going to be successful, but that doesn't mean they're not going to be disruptive. In terms of the judiciary and Trump and the judiciary, I think it's really important to remember federalism in the United States context. So Trump himself, of course, was appointing judges to the federal court in the United States, and he was incredibly successful in doing so. So Trump appointed the current judiciary is around 25% Trump appointees. I think as of 3 days ago, there was not a single vacancy on the US federal courts, which is really extraordinary. So this means that even if Trump loses, that the impact of Trump and his policy agenda is going to continue for the large part of a generation, unless the Democrats take back the Senate in the next midterms. This is assuming Biden wins, and they can then enlarge the size of the judiciary. So I think this is something we really need to keep in mind at the federal level, and particularly on the Supreme Court as well. But we also have to keep in mind the state judiciaries and the state Supreme Courts are going to be faced with these challenges. And so in most of these battleground states, the judges are elected or they're appointed and then subject to election to retain their seat. And a number of the key states are held by a partisan majority for a Republican majority. Michigan, I believe, has a Republican majority on the Michigan Supreme Court. And so you see partisanship come into play in the judiciary in a way both overtly at the state level and then also implicitly, or some would still say overtly, at the federal level as well. And so that's something that's going to continue long after Trump leaves office.
Okay. So thank you for that. So I know, Alison, I know that you follow the judiciary quite a bit, so I'm just curious as to what your thoughts are.
Well, I agree very much with what Zoe said. I thought that was very well explained. I think that there has been a shift in the US courts and the federal courts with appointments, not just by Trump, but earlier with President Reagan. People talk about the Reaganizing of the judiciary and under Bush. So there was been a concerted effort by conservative organizations like the Heritage Foundation and the Federalist Society to identify and groom particular lawyers to join the bench. And so this has been, the Trump administration, I suppose, represents the culmination of that conservative movement. And so the courts were already moving in that very conservative direction. Those who believe that the role of the court, because judges have life tenure and there's no mandatory retirement like 70, I guess, in Australia, is that these very conservative judges will be activists and overturn precedents that protect civil rights and civil liberties. Because some people take the view that the Supreme Court was designed to be a counter-majoritarian institution. And so if you have populist sentiments that want to deny people rights, you want to have a court with the power of judicial review that will protect so-called discrete and insular minorities. So I think there's great concern about activism on the part of the court, regardless of who wins the election, because of the entrenched conservatism. I think the only area where people see more protection of rights is with religious freedom, that the Supreme Court seems to be inclined to vindicate rights of religious freedom. I guess I wonder how some of the doctrines that they've developed might apply to the election cases, because in the old days, if courts thought something was a political question, it was too hot to handle and they weren't supposed to hear those cases. But it seems since Bush v. Gore and other more recent cases that doctrine is not used to prevent courts from hearing cases which are too political and where they might be seen to have a conflict of interest. I think if Biden is the one who wins, the Supreme Court could move in really exciting directions. He declined to give a list of names, but he did make a public commitment to appointing the first Black woman to the court. And so he's been criticized for not circulating a list of names, although the National Review, a conservative publication, assembled a list of names that they claimed that he was going to put forward, which don't match the names that people who know about his preferences actually give. But there are a couple of names that I think of people who are quite extraordinary. One is California Supreme Court Justice Leondra Kruger, who was a graduate of Harvard College, Yale Law School. She was editor of the Yale Law Journal. She worked in the Solicitor General's office under both Republican and Democrat administrations. When she was appointed to, and she's argued at least a dozen cases before the Supreme Court. So Justice Leondra Kruger would be an extraordinary addition to the US Supreme Court. When she was sworn in to the California Supreme Court, appointed by Governor Jerry Brown, she was at that time the youngest justice in the state's history. She also happens to be from Pasadena, where I'm from, so I'm rooting for her if there's a chance. Another name that seems to be circulating for Biden is a federal district court judge, Ketanji Brown Jackson, who also has really remarkable credentials, also went to Harvard and Harvard Law School, and has had a tremendous experience both in private practice as a federal public defender at the United States Sentencing Commission. And both of them have clerked for members of the federal bench, including the Supreme Court. So Judge Jackson apparently was on the list of President Obama when he eventually chose Judge Merrick Garland, the one who didn't get considered because it was too close to an election. Suddenly the Republicans changed their tune in what some thought was a hypocritical move. There's also another person, Professor Melissa Murray, a professor at NYU Law School, who clerked for Justice Sotomayor, who was the interim dean at Berkeley Law School. So if Biden does get elected, I think that could be a really exciting development, a real change in the court. I don't know why Michelle Obama's name hasn't come up, but I think people would be pretty enthusiastic about that. There is a long list of people, and I won't go through them all, but Trump has a list of other people he would nominate to the US Supreme Court, and they, in general, are known for having records of hostility to civil rights and to have rendered decisions that undermine protections for workers and immigrants. And if people are interested, I could give some examples of those. I think one of the ones that shocked me the most was Charles Kennedy on the Supreme Court of Florida, because he's written various bills when he was in the legislature curtailing reproductive rights, and that in a recent highly publicized case, he voted on the Florida Supreme Court to uphold the death penalty. And when the case went to the US Supreme Court, even Chief Justice Roberts and conservative justices Scalia and Thomas thought that imposing the death penalty was unconstitutional. So I think that we're concerned about the future of the judiciary because it has so many conservatives appointed, but as Zoe said, there aren't that many openings, so maybe I'm worrying prematurely.
Okay. Thanks for that, Alison. So Chris, since you're at a law school, I'm just curious as to what an American law school is thinking about the nature of the judiciary going forward.
Yeah, I mean, to pick up off something that Zoe said in terms of the composition of the courts, President Trump and the Republicans, they have been extraordinarily successful at seating judge after judge after judge at every level. And part of this strategy Trump has talked about quite out in the open is if it comes down to a lawsuit with the election, he has his quote unquote people looking after his back. Now, whether they will actually agree with that assessment of what their role on the court is one thing, but that's how he's looking at it. And it is really, really important for us to consider what winning a case means, because if we look at it in a very narrow format where we say a successful case is one in which the court decides for you, we are missing a whole range of things that Trump is doing in bringing these cases forward. As a developer and a business person, he brought suit after suit after suit, many of them completely meritless, and he would never back down and settle. Part of the power of bringing a suit is merely bringing a suit and tying somebody up in court for a certain period of time. He has a track record of doing that, and that is his modus operandi, both before he took the presidency, and that's what he's doing now. So these cases that he and his lawyer, Rudolph Giuliani, they are in large part either meritless or very unlikely to pass muster on issues of standing or on the merits. But what he is doing is projecting enormous power in terms of, one, having his party and his base rally around him around a meritless claim, thinking that it has validity or presuming it has validity. And secondly, he's trying to run out the clock till December 14th. December 14th is a crucial day when the electors need to get together and cast their votes. And if they have been held up in court, if all these lawsuits have not been settled, there will be what one could legitimately call a constitutional crisis with respect to how we choose the president and vice president, which, according to our law, goes to members of Congress and the Senate. We will be in uncharted waters, and there could be a great deal of chaos, which is precisely what Trump thrives on. He wants to take us into these uncharted waters because he has a greater capacity to do what he wants to do when he has gone past the boundaries of our precedent. So that's something that we really need to consider when we are thinking about whether or not he can do this, whether or not he's likely to be successful. No, not in terms of winning the cases, but successful perhaps in terms of sowing discord and chaos and throwing a wrench in the works, yes.
Okay. Yeah, so thanks for that. I just want to add a footnote, again, for Australian audiences. So this is the difference between the training of lawyers in the United States versus training of lawyers in Australia. So in Australia, at the law schools, when they teach legal ethics, part of this involves like a duty to the court, right? And a duty to sort of maintain the integrity of the judicial process and the notions of justice, fairness, et cetera, these kinds of things. In the United States, with the law schools, when they're training lawyers, the emphasis is much more about advocacy on behalf of your client. So even if it's a situation that, as much as you may know that there may not be much merit to the case, if the strategy of a lawsuit is furthering the interests of your client, then you are still fulfilling your duties as an advocate. Now, something that Chris had mentioned was about the issue of electors. So this is referencing the nature of electoral college and sort of the risks or the hazards of what's playing out now with the potential of the role of the judiciary versus the institution of the electoral college and the way the electoral college works. And so let's chat with Zoe first, because I know that she's done some work in this area, and then I'll turn to the others. So Zoe?
Yeah, so the US is really fascinating. I think this can nicely tie in with thinking about the judiciary as well and what kinds of challenges might make it to the US Supreme Court. So in the US, we don't vote for the president. In fact, we might tick the name next to Joe Biden or Donald Trump, but we're actually voting for what are called electors, right? Electors are those people as part of the electoral college that are chosen by the chairs of state political parties. And they pledge to vote for that party's presidential candidate in the electoral college. So you're actually voting for a state level slate, for example, of Biden electors, who will then cast their votes on December 14, like was mentioned earlier, which is a drop dead date. They'll cast their votes for Joe Biden. And so there are a total of 538 electoral college votes, and the candidate, as we know, needs the 260 to win. So that's how the electoral college itself works, and it's an entrenched part of the constitutional system. The way I think that it's really important to consider the judiciary in the context of the electoral college is the possible challenge to the slate, the actual slate that goes up from the college itself. So the process is a little strange. There was a disputed election actually in 1876, which came to this. And so what happens is that the electoral college pledges to vote for the candidate that the state actually chooses, the voters in the state chose, but the legislature that ran a close second really didn't want that particular slate to be voted up. So they put their own slate of electoral college voters up as well. So it's like a shadow electoral college. And so then both electoral colleges within a state send that slate to Congress, and Congress is like, well, we have to choose which is the valid electoral college vote for the state of Pennsylvania, for example. And so there's a possibility you can see down the line that the Supreme Court might be faced with assessing a challenge on the basis of which electoral college slate is valid or not. Now, as a matter of legal principle based on various constitutional doctrines, I don't think the Supreme Court could hear that. But again, it's a whole new world. Who knows what the Supreme Court's going to do with that?
And then Shawn, I know you had a comment since you had some work on the Electoral College.
Yeah, so I mean, the Electoral College is a strange beast, and in the Constitutional Convention, what's strange about it is it's pretty much the compromise they come up with when they can't figure out how to elect the president. So they basically circle around with various arguments, but have difficulty in figuring out in terms of re-election and who does the selecting and all of this, and so that they come up with this convoluted structure, and so it's somewhat of a historical accident. It's something that's probably immutable. So there are questions here in the comment about you know, how does this affect everything? Well, it affects everything about the campaign, because since the rules of the campaign are focused on how we gather these electoral votes, that's gonna structure the campaign. As Zoe touched upon, there's a lot of strange procedural elements of this, because there are actual physical people that serve at an intermediate role. If there was ever something you'd hope you could have sort of somewhat of a consensus, at least on the constitutional change, would be, even if you kept this weighted voting system, that it could just be direct. That because the elements of both faithless electors, which could become a problem here if we have a 270-268 split, all it takes is one person to really throw everything out of sync. What Chris touched upon, which was all of these deadlines that you could run out the clock against, which could result in a state just not getting to vote or dispute on what the votes are allocated, all have to do with these deadlines that are set for the physical meeting of the people that are mandated by the Constitution. They basically agreed upon like a due date of a week before to have everything settled, so the electors can meet and have it, because they have to be on the same day. If it was just a tabulation that was just weighted in Congress, that element would, that's probably the weirdest thing about the Electoral College. Now, the clear inequality in terms of the voting is the one that sort of strikes you the most, but as we're seeing, the procedural elements are going to play a critical role here.
Yeah. So just regarding the procedure, so again, for the Australian audiences, I just want to clarify sort of the way the mechanics work in the United States. So with the Electoral College, even though we're getting the vote counts in now, there's a process of certification of the final results. So, you know, this means that they're going to get the vote counts, then there's probably inevitably, you know, vote recounts either on request or if it's compulsory. And then each state has different deadlines when the governor has to issue what's called a certificate of ascertainment to certify the electors. The electors for then the states meet, and then they have until December 14th this year. It's going to be December 14th to then issue what's called a certificate of vote, where they indicate which way they're going to vote. An increasing number of states have passed laws that forbid faithless electors. Basically, that they compel electors to follow the voting count in the state. And then Congress in January will then have a session where they then count the electoral votes. And then that's after that point is when you start to wonder what happens. And if it's a situation where neither candidate gets 270 electoral votes, this is where you get the situation where the House of Representatives will choose the president and the Senate will choose the vice president. And it's not, so in the Senate, it's an absolute majority. So whoever gets a majority of Senate votes becomes the vice president. But in the House of Representatives, if they're forced to go ahead and choose the president, it goes by state delegates. And at the moment, 26 states have a majority Republican presence. And so, which means that if it does go to the House and the House is choosing the president, you're going to get a situation where at the moment, Trump would win that vote count. Okay, so in the interest of time, we're going to transition now to then talking about the consequences of the election, Trump or Biden, potentially for the makeup of the American federal institutions, and also for domestic politics. So for that, I want to touch base with Alison and Cher. So with Alison, I'd like to go to you first. Is that okay? Or
Let Cher go.
okay, Cher, you have a comment? Your microphone's off.
So I will address some of the concerning issues by the Trump administration. So it has been argued that the Trump administration approach has emboldened opponents of human rights and has undermined the nation's moral standing. And several policies are particularly concerning. One thing I would like to address is abortion rights, the reproductive rights. So, conservative movement in the United States have long tried to restrict reproductive rights, but the Trump administration, their approach has reached a new high. We could say that Trump's federal budget proposals and rules have targeted reproductive health programs that provide critical assistance to women and families in domestic and foreign budget accounts. So this is so-called a global gag rule, which restricts U.S. funds for NGOs and non-governmental organizations that provide abortion counseling and services. And it also has a domestic counterpart called domestic gag rule. So essentially both policies were attempted to restrict reproductive rights at home and also abroad. So I think this is particularly concerning. The second thing is the second issue is the LGBTQ rights. So despite campaign pledges to protect the LGBT community, the Trump administration has issued regulations, executive orders, and he loved using executive orders and policies that have largely reversed Obama-era advances to improve the lives of LGBTQ community. For example, the Trump administration has argued in 3 U.S. Supreme Court cases that discrimination protection on the basis of sex should not be applied to LGBTQ individuals. And it also banned transgender troops from serving in the military and refused to enforce protections prohibiting discrimination based on gender identity and sexual orientation for students and workers, and proposed a new regulation that could roll back the rights of LGBTQ individuals. So activists, they have been hoping for a more holistic approach, protecting and promoting human rights domestically from a new administration. So another issue, I think it's racial relation. So this is also tied to immigration. This is also tied to Black Lives Matters. So President Trump, he himself has repeatedly expressed racist views, right? And he has referred to migration as an invasion, and he tweeted that the 4 U.S. Congresswomen of color should go back to the countries they came from. And this is a racist trope used to denigrate people of color who often are U.S. citizens for generations. And he also refuses to condemn violent white supremacy. So this type of racist rhetoric, according to some researchers, has contributed to a significant rise in hate crimes at home, and also it could harm vulnerable communities abroad. So related to this is the immigration rhetoric. We could say that Trump administration has deviated from previous administrations, and its immigration policy essentially favor those who are Christian and who are white and who are wealthy to immigrate to the United States. And it has also proposed changes to the U.S. immigration system that could favor the more privileged, while shutting pathways to refugees, to those most vulnerable, including children, the LGBTQ community, and also people with disabilities, and also those people in need of medical care. So I would say this is consistent with his largely racist rhetoric during the campaign, and for his base, people may argue that he has fulfilled his promises, right, by building the wall. I mean, whether there's just a partial wall or not, and by issuing more restrictive immigration policies. And but for people outside his base, those issues are particularly concerning, and those issues become the hotly debated ones during the 2016 campaign. And this year, the campaign rhetoric still follows some of those issues from 2016, but because of COVID, because of economy, it changed a little bit. They are not a focus, but the impact of those policies have been devastating. So it would take years to compare to where we were.
Thanks for that. So Alison, Cher seems quite pessimistic. So I'm just curious if you feel the same level of pessimism.
Well, I share many of her views, and I think it was wonderfully explained. I see the current election as reflecting really a cultural divide about who should be honored, how do we treat people with respect, how do we stop police brutality, and we've reached a moment in history where there's a reckoning with the legacy of the past. So these terrible developments have occurred, but it has helped, I think, spark interest in questions of civil rights and social justice. The fact that these youth movements, these student groups and so on are engaged in these activities, I think may be a response to this rhetoric of hate, basically. I think the appalling statements about women and their bodies and so on that have been associated with the Trump administration, even if people have voted for him, I think some people gave them pause that the president of the United States would speak like that. And I think the Me Too movement is a reflection of some people being fed up with that kind of vulgar discussion and so on. I think Native Americans are a group also that has been badly treated. I think Cher covered most of the groups that have been marginalized and badly treated during the past administration, but Native Americans have had even trouble with voting because you had to have a street address, and many who live on reservations they have a PO box and so on. So there are many groups, I think, that feel that a regime change now would be in their interests. And so I guess because there's this sharp divide that's ideological and we're so hyperpolarized, some people use the term tribalism, people fear there may be civil unrest following the election. And I hate to mention it because I think people think that if the media keeps mentioning that, it'll give people the idea, the power of suggestion. And I guess there was such concern that the Wall Street Journal reported that Walmart had initially removed firearms and ammunition from their stores because of fear that people would, run around with guns. We have tremendous gun violence in the United States. It's an epidemic. And so, as was mentioned earlier, that stores have been boarded up and so on, but this could be a moral panic. We hope this is an urban legend. We hope that this is something that's not going to happen. And certainly with all the different challenges we've heard about, it will take so long before we know what the election is that maybe people will have time to be calm and think of ways to engage in deliberation to solve some of these conflicts. Another aspect that I see in the domestic discussion is a false dichotomy between whether the economy is more important or the pandemic is more important, and that Trump is perceived as better dealing with the economy and Biden is thought to would be better at handling the pandemic. This is a false dichotomy. These things are obviously related, and the pandemic has caused many people to lose their jobs and people to be placed on furlough and so on. And I guess finally, two points. One other point about the federal agencies, I worry about the politicization of federal agencies and how science is being treated in such a way that people may not trust the kinds of political institutions that they need to when a vaccine is available and safe. And so I think that the way science has been politicized by the federal agencies under the Trump administration is another concern that I think is reflected in some of the discourse in the United States. And then my last point is just the United States attitude towards multilateralism. I think that it's very clear that the Trump administration has a narrow understanding of human rights, if there is even one. The Pompeo Commission report on unalienable rights mentions only the right to private property and the right to religious liberty. If the Biden administration comes in, I think it's clear that we would return to a more complete understanding of human rights. We would rejoin the World Health Organization. How could we leave it during a pandemic? we would maybe join the International Criminal Court. We might ratify the Children's Convention. We're the only country in the world that hasn't. So I guess the hope is that the United States would re-engage in terms of our domestic politics, and that the leadership would get back into that community. So I am pessimistic, but I guess I hope that that there is change underway, that these social movements that Cher has been emphasizing, I think they should give us hope in the future.
Mm-hmm. So we're going to need to transition here to then talk about sort of the consequences for foreign policy and international relations. But before that, I want to give Zoe and Shawn and Chris sort of an opportunity to respond to sort of the observations about the domestic politics and sort of the social issues that may or may not be affected from this election.
I'm happy to start if you like. I think that this election, I think this is an election for the Republican Party. So Trump may lose the presidency, but I think ultimately the Republican Party wins out of this election. I think it has really big consequences for domestic policy in the United States. So why I'm saying that I think that the Republicans have won this is that first there is a huge heightened political engagement on the part of Republican voters. And that comes on the back of increased polarization in the electorate itself. They lost Trump, who was a loose cannon, if we're going to be, that's the politically correct term that we'll stick with. But they also held their majorities in the House. Well, they haven't done a majority, but they held their seats in the House. It's touch and go whether they're going to keep the majority in the Senate. But really importantly, they've held the majorities in the House, their legislative assemblies in the states. And that's really important in the US domestic context, given that the states control the redistricting and control the federal election districts going forward. So 2020 is a big year for redistricting. Every 10 years, we get the census results, and then the state legislatures have responsibility for drawing those districting lines for elections for the next federal election. Now, in some states, that's been passed off to an independent commission or some kind of bipartisan commission, but in a number of states, it hasn't. And so some of the states that were being really closely watched were Texas, for example, where there was control that was up. And Arizona was another state where we were watching really closely to look for a shift in the composition of the legislature so that redistricting was more bipartisan or it became over to Democratic control. And that just hasn't seemed to have happened. And so that really means that these gerrymandering and voter suppression efforts that we see are necessarily going to continue. And so this kind of close call and these kinds of political fights that we're seeing are going to continue going forward. And I think the final thing that's really important for domestic politics is obviously the US Supreme Court now has a majority Republican appointed justices. And so we see a 6-3 ideological conservative liberal makeup. And that really matters for a number of things, particularly for thinking about groups, particularly women. And so Roe v. Wade and the overturning of Roe v. Wade has mattered a lot. And so for the Australian audience, Roe v. Wade is the case where the US Supreme Court declared that there was a fundamental right to an abortion that was enshrined in the US Constitution under the idea of liberty. And it was actually thought once before that Roe v. Wade would be overturned, saying that that right actually isn't a fundamental right in the Constitution. Oops, we made a mistake. Now, the court has pared that back quite significantly since the original articulation of the Roe v. Wade right. And it really is primed now for that to be overturned if that's what the court makes the decision to do. And that's really going to have an immediate effect because there are things that lawyers call zombie laws and trigger laws that are sitting on the books in a number of these states. So zombie laws are those laws that are just sitting there on the books that can't be enforced because Roe v. Wade stands in the way. Whereas trigger laws are also laws that are sitting on the book which immediately come into effect to ban abortion across the board if Roe v. Wade's overturned. So a number of states have this situation, legal situation, where we're going to end up with the right to abortion being severely restricted in a good percentage of states across the United States. So the Trump presidency and this election combined, I think are going to have serious ramifications for US domestic policy going forward for the next decade.
Okay. And Chris, I'm sorry, you were going to say something.
Yeah, I wanted to pick up on some of what Cher and Alison were saying, in particular about social movements and that landscape, and discuss some of the pitfalls or hazards that we have to look out for in the present and certainly in the future. And in particular, I want to talk about the idea of civic engagement. The idea of civic engagement is one that scholars and research firms have conducted political polling and demographic research on, and suggests that the more involved and the more engaged individuals are with the civic life of their community, of their state, and within their country, the better off everyone's going to be. So you have sort of a small r Republican framework for looking at how we can be productive in society. And Pew Research Center, it's a nonpartisan research firm, they just came out with a study, and they talked about things like voting, attending a political meeting in one's own community, being an active member, as active member of a group that tries to influence policy or government functioning. These sorts of things, they suggest, are the things that are going to bring us out of some of the issues and problems that we have. But what they don't really talk about is our ability to speak and communicate with people with whom we disagree. And that is one of the things that really, really worries me, because you can have a whole community scoring 100% on these sort of civic engagement tests that you have where everyone votes, everyone signs petitions, everybody works for volunteering for a political party or candidate. But they simply cannot communicate with people from the other side. And what I think we're seeing in our politics is a function of not just the public's inability to communicate with others, but our elected officials and representatives. And this polarization is taking place from the ground up. And one of the big things that President Trump's election in 2016, and now how close he is, regardless of whether he wins, is this idea that he believes he does not have to speak to a single person of the other party or represent a single person of the other party, and he can still win or come extremely close. And that is really worrying, because what we see in election politics is oftentimes what we see in life in general. What works will continue. And so if that ends up being a strategy where you can win, come close to winning, that's probably going to be the way our politics operate for some time in the future. And what does that say about our ability to get out of the situation we're in? I don't know, but I know that being able to engage and talk to people that you disagree with is something that we need to work a lot more on.
Okay, so thank you for that. We're running, starting to get down to about the 12 to 10 minute mark. So I just want to give everyone an opportunity to help with a wrap up here about sort of the takeaways or the implications for the rest of the world and for Australia. And so we're going to go around all the speakers and sort of allow everyone to give closing comments. So Shawn, did you want to start that off?
Sure. So, I mean, I think sort of the most obvious is that Australia is sort of in a sort of a precarious situation in terms of, you know, Maurice Payne this morning on News Breakfast is probably a perfect example of this, where she's just trying to, like, do not like drag me into picking sides on any of this. Well, I'm sure everything, and she eventually says all the votes should be counted, but I'm sure everything will work out and we will deal with everyone, and we'll continue our partnership. We can imagine, though, that partnership might be very different or less strong with, say, Trump than Biden would be. So if I think we all expect that probably at the end of the mess that we've been describing, that it likely will be Biden. And while he may be limited in many ways, the foreign policy aspect is one in which he'll have freer reign. And so it'll be a little bit more normal. It'll be hard to reset completely because enough damage has been done. You can't necessarily what happens in 2024. Well, you know, it's someone who's just more efficient than Trump, but it has a similar outlook, get elected and then. So there'll be a little bit less trust, but it's certainly probably a little bit more normal than if Trump's in a second term and you have to start thinking, you still have to be on good terms, but you're really starting to reconsider the possible options and sort of more reapproachment with maybe China or really probably, I'm not really sure where they move from that, but it certainly would be probably less reliant on the US.
Zoe?
Yeah, look, I think I take the final comments in a little bit different direction than Shawn, and just sort of say that what I really take from what we're seeing here today and what we've seen over the last sort of 4 years is that institutions and institutional design really matters for constraining behavior, but importantly, who those institutional actors are and their willingness to be constrained by convention is also very important. And in Trump, we had a president, or have a president, we're not sure yet. Although I just saw pop up Fox News just called Arizona for Biden. So maybe we're closer to the Biden presidency being announced. But we had a president in Trump who was willing to ignore those conventions and really set a model for the ignoring of institutional conventions that trickled down into the Republican Party and the Republican senators and the Republican members of the House of Representatives. And so I worry, and what I take from this is that the institutions and the conventions have been really eroded in American politics. And I also worry that that's going to carry over to the Supreme Court, and we're going to see that partisanship really become entrenched, and the idea of being a Republican justice is entrenched rather than being a justice of the United States Supreme Court that really has to act with the legitimacy and the imprimatur of that institution rather than the imprimatur of the Republican Party. And so that's my largest concern coming out of all of this. But, you know, there are a few things that give me hope, right? We're about to see, I think, the nation's first African-American, Asian-American vice president, female vice president, the first female vice president, first female elected to higher office. And so I think that's something, that's one of those things that gives me some hope, at least as somebody who prioritizes, you know, representation in our institutions. And we're also going to see, New Mexico has the first slate of representatives who are all minority women or women of color, including a Native American woman who is being reelected. And in Delaware, we have the first state senator who's openly transgender. And so we're starting to see potentially some small incremental shifts. My concern is that it's not enough in the face of the eroded conventions that Trump has really allowed to occur and that the Republican members of Congress have picked up on and run with.
Okay. So Cher, I know that, you know, a lot of the work that you do is with respect to like human rights and sort of the international standards. So I'm just curious if you had thoughts about what the rest of the world should be concerned about out of the US.
I think before this panel, I just had my graduate course, and I told my students, you know, hopefully this is the beginning of a new era. And my students, they were so excited because they all of them voted for Biden, and they were hoping this level of civil engagement will go a long way for the community and also for the country and also for the world. So my sentiment from this younger generation is that the new administration hopefully could start to bring back some sense about normalcy in terms of upholding, you know, democratic values and democratic institutions and democratic systems, and also upholding moral principles we have long believed in, and building international cooperation and protecting and promoting human rights, domestically also abroad. My concern is, you know, some people argue Trump has been best and also the worst gift that has happened to the feminist movement, happened to the social activism in general. So if this is a new administration, would this impact the level of civil engagement? Would this lead to some type of a demobilization among activists? Because in the past 4 years, Trump and his policies has become the one of the leading factors for mobilization. And so that is kind of a, I think, a small concern, but the sentiment is largely hopeful. So my student give me this sentence, say they can let the healing begin, and I feel so energized. And so I think before this election, I was so anxious, but looking at my students and kind of listening to all kinds of comments I gathered from this panel, I feel that there's a hope, and it will take a long time, but a change of a sentiment, a change of a culture is possible.
Okay. So thank you for that, Cher. So Alison?
Well, there's so many serious problems in the United States, income inequality, the number of people experiencing homelessness. There was an obscene amount of money spent on this election, and the hypocrisy of our leaders in changing the rules to suit their own parties. I think the rest of the world should be worried that Americans are going to be moving to their countries. I think people are used to joke about the fact that they were going to move to Canada, but Canada was building a wall. I think people now are really trying to see if they can seek asylum, political asylum elsewhere. So I think a lot is at stake in this election till we hear. I too am very excited about the possibility of a woman being in higher office. I remember working at the Mondale Ferraro National Convention in San Francisco, and the fact that a woman can even be on the ticket. And when Justice Sandra Day O'Connor was the first woman appointed to the court. So I think it does inspire some of us to see that there are possibilities, and that maybe Americans can learn from other countries where they have gender quotas, where women are in more leadership positions that have been possible in the United States. I think that Americans tend to think that we're so important and everybody cares what happens to us. But in this case, Trump has been such an extreme disaster for us that when I was at a webinar 2 days ago on the International Criminal Court, the president of the ICC said they deliberately planned the seminar the day before because they wanted to emphasize what it would mean for the International Criminal Court, what the outcome of the US election would be. And the hope that Americans could re-engage. I think that's really important. I think we should learn from other countries how to have more have conversations with people who differ, and that civic engagement does mean engaging with people who have different points of view. And Americans haven't been very good at that lately. And we need to learn from other countries, what are best practices? How can we do this better? And so I really have appreciated this webinar and a chance to talk to people about the differences between the US and Australia, because it's really important to have this kind of cross-cultural exchange. So thank you.
So thank you. So Chris, since you're the historian, we're gonna let you have the last word, maybe put things in context.
In context, I have had a lot of people from other countries in the past, this is before the Trump administration, say, you Americans, you do the right thing eventually, but it takes a lot of cajoling for you to get there. Kind of joking, a little ribbing there. And I wonder if people still think that. And this is what worries me the most. Are our allies and those in the international space going to count on us? Are they going to look at us and say, we can count on the United States to be there and do what it says it's going to do and do the right thing when it is needed? And that is a question that one president, President Biden, President Trump, one administration can't answer. It has to be successive administration after administration after administration. Instead of a 4-year time horizon, having the world count on us, it needs to be 20, 30, 40, 50, 60-year time horizon. And I don't know how we make that promise. I don't want to end on a down note, but we really in this country need to look beyond the next election cycle. We have a time horizon of 4 years in this country, and we need to have a time horizon of 100 or 150 years. If we're thinking about our founding, if we're thinking about how the promises that our founders made to us are still living true and the warnings that they gave us. I'll just end on one point to that effect. In George Washington's farewell address, one of the things that he said was that we as a country need to be wary of factionalism. And that, by that he meant political parties, in which the party and the party's interest trumps that, God, I don't want to use that word, trumps that over that of the Constitution. He also warned about foreign interference, having a way of changing public opinion and presenting misinformation. And so in many ways, he was extraordinarily prescient in terms of some of the dangers and pitfalls that he saw lying ahead and that we ourselves have fallen into. I think we can right this ship. I think we can turn things around, but it's going to take a concerted effort, and it's going to take everybody working together to identify what the problems are and how we can have a country that the rest of the world can count on like they once did.
All right, so thanks for that, Chris. So I think everyone has provided excellent finishes to the discussion today. And I think we had a very informative and hopefully useful webinar for the audience. And I hope a lot of people had come away from this session with greater level of understanding about the US elections and a greater level of awareness about the potential implications, not just for the United States, but also for US allies and the rest of the world in general. The only comment I have is that, the United States is just one democracy out of many in the world. There are many different kinds. We're all sort of working our way through the meaning of democracy and particularly a liberal democracy and liberal democratic values. We're just part of a family of societies that believe in certain ideals. And just like any family, you can pick your friends, but you can't pick your relatives. And so we're just gonna have to try and work together as well as we can with that. So I see that we're actually a little bit over time, so apologies for that. We're going to finish there today, and thank you for the audience. I want to thank the speakers, Alison, Zoe, Cher, Shawn, and Chris for their time. I want to give particular thanks to the ANU College of Marketing, so I'll mention them by name, Gian, Teo, and Tom Fearon for their patience and for the diligence and tireless efforts to make this happen. And then we'll thank the Australian National University for hosting this, and particularly the College of Law. So thanks again to the audience, and thank you, and hopefully you enjoyed this. So take care.